In Magic the Gathering, there is a large pool of cards that have been recognized by the community as being generically good at reducing random chance. These staples are low-cost cards that generally do not require any specific setup and can provide repeated value over many turns, rather than being one-time effects. Because they're basically always useful, they see a ton of play and are generally considered auto-includes in decks which play in that color identity. Unlike many cards, you need a reason not to play these cards. Doesn't mean they're the best cards out there, although sometimes they are, but it's pretty hard to go wrong with them. Cards like Lotho Corrupt Sheriff, Propaganda, Esper Sentinel, Delighted Halfling, and Stormkiln Artist, to name a few. These cards are cheap and give repeatable value that requires no setup or other specific types of cards to be played in tandem with. Even if you aren't playing an Aristocrats deck, Skull Clamp is still a great card to include in your deck. Odds are, some of your creatures will die throughout the game, and 1 mana to draw 2 cards is a very good return on investment. Most decks would at worst remain the same level of consistency and power by adding in 1 or more of these cards. Many decks would be made better by adding them in. The downside of cards like these is that they are not inherently very thematic. Sure, there are decks where they will fit thematically better than others. Skull Clamp in a Skeleton Aristocrats deck, or paired with mad scientists like Yawgmoth or Geralf, fit very well both mechanically and thematically. However, you do not have to be playing halflings, treasures, or stacks in order to get value out of a card like Lotho, Corrupt Sheriff. You could stick him into any deck running black and white, and he would produce value, turn after turn. Often more value than you could produce with an on-theme card. Treasures are generic value, usable by a player for any cost. It also takes no setup on our part to get our opponents to cast more than 1 spell in a turn. These generic cards represent a constant temptation to players, the temptation to sacrifice theme for power. For some players, this choice is easy. Theme Shmeen, give me the powerful cards. For my Bracket 2 brethren, however, theme is really important, and it's often a genuine dilemma to have to choose between a thematic card and a powerful card. Personally, I have the desire to make creative and unique decks, but I also like my decks to win and have consistent gameplay patterns, and sometimes this can cause big issues when it comes to deciding what cards to include and what cards to cut. When trying to play a unique or obscure theme that isn't powerful, it can feel like you have to play those generic pieces just so that you can keep up. This leads to a pretty ironic relationship, where the more unique you want the core theme of your deck to be, the more you might end up relying on generic value pieces to support the theme. There are situations, however, where a deck is fully capable of being powerful and effective without relying on the generic staples. Let's examine 2 of my favorite decks to play: my side-graded Human Tribal Precon and my Hidden Commander Curses deck, so that we can see this contrast clearly. For both being Bracket 2 decks, they really couldn't be more different. My Human Tribal deck, helmed by Jarina Kudrow, was the first deck I ever owned. Originally, it was the Ruthless Regiment Precon from the 2020 Ikoria set. It has a very straightforward Human Tribal game plan. Produce a wide board full of small creatures and tokens, buff them using an Anthem effect, like but not limited to the one found on the Commander, punch somebody in the teeth with an overwhelming amount of ramped up and disposable creatures. I've since side-graded the deck, keeping many of the themes and just under 50% of the original cards. It's a pretty classic Human Tribal deck. Nothing special to see here. Originally, my side grades were focused on simply increasing power of the deck, which, seeing as I was new to the game, led to mixed results and overall diluted the theme of the deck. I didn't really have any sort of theme in mind and mostly just scrolled EDH rec for cards that I thought looked good. Eventually, I had a pile of mash that I hardly recognized. After some reflection, I decided I wanted to return the deck to some of its former themes and get rid of a lot of the generic mush I had filled it with. This led to a whole lot more side grades. One of the focuses of my side grading was to make the deck more human-y. I started replacing generic cards with cards I felt fit the overall theme more, even if they weren't quite as strong. I replaced some of the instants and sorceries with human creatures that had similar effects. This really wasn't difficult to do. There's so many human cards out there, many of which have some pretty wild effects. The deck runs efficiently, pumping out humans turn after turn, and often swinging for big damage quickly and consistently. I'm actually still in the process of weeding out some of the generic cards that I added in originally, but I'm much happier now with the tightening down of the theme that I've done so far. That being said, even with the increases in humanness within the deck, there isn't anything particularly unique about this deck, but it's still pretty tight thematically, and I like it. This is my Human Tribal deck. There are many like it, but this one is mine. The second deck is my Tatsunari Toad Rider Curses deck that runs with a hidden commander, Jon Irenicus Shattered One. This deck is actually a combination of 2 different decks that I had tried and failed to build in the past: a Jon Irenicus Relentless Rats deck and a Tatsunari Toad Rider Curses deck. Both decks spent around a year in my deck rotation constantly being tweaked and adjusted, but neither of them ever felt right, and I ended up scrapping both of them. The Relentless Rats deck, the third iteration of a Relentless Rats deck I had built, was slow, repetitive, and overall just ineffective. It struggled to draw cards and produce mana, and often my opponents weren't too keen on giant rats being passed out to the other players at the table. Typically, either my commander or my rats would be removed quickly, leaving me with no board state and no way to draw cards. The Curses deck did a little better, but only because I ended up accidentally straying from the Curses theme. Turns out there aren't a lot of curse cards out there. 24 total in Sultai colors. Some are really fun and can be quite useful. Others, however, are just plain bad. Seriously, when is paying 4 mana to slowly exile 2 non-targeted cards from a player's graveyard good? This is hot garbage. To fill in the rest of the deck and make it semi-functional, I filled it with lots of generic enchantments to act as a way to finish the games and gain value. This worked fine, but the measly curse theme, which was supposed to be the star of the show, ended up just getting in the way of the much more efficient and powerful enchantment Aura Voltron theme, which is a playstyle I found to be really boring. So, into the trash it went. The current iteration, and by far my favorite, combined the two themes into one, which worked surprisingly well together. The deck isn't a powerhouse by any means. It folds to aggressive decks and also relies heavily on politics and staying in good graces with the table, something I'm actually quite bad at. If you want to hear me go a bit more in depth into how it operates, check out the show and tell episode of the podcast I'm on, The Magic We Have at Home. Although it isn't a particularly powerful deck, this deck is incredibly unique. EDH Rec shows only 6 Tatsunari Toad Rider decks that also have Jon Irenicus in them. Additionally, of those 6 decks, it's the only one with a Curses sub-theme. This deck is easily the most unique deck I've built, and I'm quite proud of it. However, it was very difficult to build, took multiple iterations and failures, and is still, in all of its hipster glory, a very weak deck that relies heavily on the other decks at the table to take care of one another. Also, although it has a unique identity, it has a host of very generic ramp and card draw cards, because with the overall weakness of the theme, playing with poor ramp and card draw would be an absolute nightmare. The deck also runs a suite of tutors to try and get Jon Irenicus into hand consistently. Point being, in order to get more unique, I also had to get more basic. That's okay, I love playing this deck, and although it's not actually managed to kill anyone except for the final opponent, it does have a surprising 30% win rate. Back to the comparison, both decks are firmly in bracket 2, but they're not very close at all to one another when it comes to power. The human deck is more consistent, faster, and has both a higher power floor and ceiling than the Curses deck. This means its bad games aren't nearly as bad, and its very best games are much better. I've had several games where the Curses deck played to its absolute pinnacle and still lost handedly. So, how is it that both of these decks are in the same bracket? Well, neither of them plays any game changers, mass land denial, infinite combos, or turn chaining. Additionally, while the human deck may be able to knock out a player before turn 8, it certainly isn't going to kill the whole table before then. I know the bracket system says 8 turns before anyone wins or loses, but this standard doesn't really work well for decks that win through consistent, incremental damage turn after turn. The human deck doesn't run any cards that drastically increase its board's power out of nowhere. If you die to it on turn 6 or 7, it's because it's been swinging at you for 4 or 5 straight turns. Additionally, both decks adhere strongly to a specific theme.
The Jon Irenicus deck is a unique one-of-one deck with themes of curses, goading, pillow fort, politics, and giving people big frogs to swing at each other.
The human deck runs with themes of control and order, aristocrats, aggression, teamwork, and sacrifice for the greater good. The imbalance between the two decks comes from the imbalance in support for the two themes. The themes aren't equal. Human Tribal has way more support than Curses. When kitting out the Human Tribal deck, there's an insane amount of options. Scryfall shows a total of over 2,500 human creatures in the Mardu colors. That makes it easy to find multiple human creatures who draw cards, act as various forms of removal, and even humans who can help ramp. This means I don't have to include a lot of the generic value cards in the deck because there are perfectly acceptable human versions of them. In this case, cutting the deck down to 100 cards was pretty hard, even without including a lot of the classic options. There are just so many fun options that still fit the humans-only theme. Additionally, upgrading this deck to bracket 3 would be really easy. There are plenty of changes and cards which I could put into the deck, but I haven't, including changing the commander. All of these changes could be made without sacrificing the overall humanness of the deck. Heck, Esper Sentinel is a human soldier. I could be drawing so many cards if I wanted to make this deck bracket 3. What makes this deck special to me, though, isn't the power level, but rather the specific cards I've chosen to try and cultivate a specific vibe and power level that fits within my playgroup, as well as the nostalgia factor of it being my first ever deck. There are a million, or at least 20,000, human tribal decks out there. However, it's likely that while they have some overlap, they're also all unique in some way or another due to the overwhelming amount of options available for the theme. The possibility for a human tribal deck is endless because the theme is so generic and has seen so many cards printed into it over the years. The Trinket Mage actually just posted a video about the same idea. You should check it out. Niche decks, ironically, end up being more generic than common themes because the common themes have so many more options to choose from when deck building. There are many themes like this. Themes like +1/+1 counters, life gain, artifacts, treasures, Spellslinger, aristocrats, and equipments. These are just some of the staple themes with a massive quantity of support printed for them. There are also kindred themes like dragons, elves, zombies, and vampires, which are among people's favorites and get printed all the time. There are entire sets and planes around printing these tribes, which ensures tons of new options every year. This quantity of options also means that decks can play at high power levels while still holding on to a thematic identity. This isn't a problem on its own, but it does mean that a Bracket 2 deck built with one or more of these themes typically has more access to thematic cards that are also quite powerful than a less supported theme. So the Bracket 2 Elf deck likely has a higher power ceiling and floor than the Bracket 2 Crab deck, unless the Crab deck is willing to play a lot of generic staples to help bridge the gap. At Bracket 2, where decks are supposed to be thematic, this support variance can cause balance issues because the players who stay true to an undersupported theme will feel outmatched by players staying true to a supported theme. My human tribal deck is certainly thematically built around humans. There are around 40 creatures in the deck, and only a few of them aren't actually humans. The coherence to the theme isn't hard to achieve, and the deck doesn't take a big hit to its power by doing so. It doesn't have to sacrifice power in order to achieve the theme. Human tribal, and many themes like it, get to have their cake and eat it too. Curses deck, however, absolutely has to sacrifice power to theme. Curses just aren't very good. There isn't a lot of them. There are even few that are actually useful. They also rely on the game going really long, and they can draw unwanted attention. Choosing to adhere to this theme, combining curses with Jon Irenicus and giving away frogs, is choosing to play at low power. The deck could be upgraded, but not without significant loss to its identity and playstyle. The deck runs only 14 of the 24 available curses. Of those 14 that it does run, only 6 of them have consistent useful effects. The other 8 have some fine case use, but can feel like dead draws some of the time. A new set with a handful of new curses being printed would potentially increase both the power and theme of this deck. It's currently limited a lot by its less supported theme. I'm not complaining by any means. I built the deck and I choose to play it regularly. I really like this deck, and its low power makes it challenging to play. I'm also really horrible at politics, so playing a deck that can only win if it makes friends and stays out of the public eye really forces me into doing something I'm uncomfortable with. But it's fun. I am going to complain a little bit, though, because we've already gotten Wilds of Eldraine and now Lorwyn Eclipsed without any new curses being printed. That just feels like a missed opportunity, if you ask me. I mean, there's literally a Lorwyn deck with curse in the name, and its commander's name as well, and yet, no curses to be found. This deck is actually pretty cool, and I'm stoked to see Wizards printing less friendly precons, but come on, man, no new curses? Getting back to the point, my curse deck and my human tribal deck are both Bracket 2 decks. Both are expected to play against each other. However, from their conception, they're not equal. The raw amount of human cards to work with and choose from ensures that I can keep the deck powerful and efficient while still remaining true to the theme. The curse deck, on the other hand, requires supplementation with generic value cards and tutors, just to make its niche game plan a reality every now and again. The imbalance of theme support isn't really something I can ever actually see being fixed. WotC can't be expected to print lots of niche support for every theme. However, I do think there could be a bit of a remedy for the situation, but it would take a bit of a change in the public perception of Bracket 1. I like Bracket 1 as a concept, but I think that the way the community embraced it is a little off, and some distinctions could be made that would help improve this whole theme imbalance situation. But this video has gone on long enough, so you'll have to wait until the next one to hear my thoughts on Bracket 1. I hope you enjoyed the video. What undersupported themes do you enjoy playing? Do you want them to get more support, or would you rather they stay obscure? Let me know in the comments. Also, if you enjoyed obscure themes in Bracket 2 brews, check out the podcast I'm a part of, The Magic We Have at Home. My friends and I build and playtest new Bracket 2 decks to try and expand our creative potential. If you made it this far, thanks for watching, and have a great day.